Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're asking something pretty fundamental about these big reasoning models.
Yeah, like do they really need to think so much? That whole long step-by-step process.
Exactly. Is all that internal monologue, that chain of thought stuff we see, actually essential for getting top performance?
Well, we're digging into a really interesting paper today that tackles exactly that. It's from Mei Leal at UC Berkeley and AI2 called Reasoning Models Can Be Effective Without Thinking.
Okay, without thinking. It's a bold title.
It is, and for our listeners who want the quick takeaway, the paper shows, using a pretty advanced model, DeepSeek R1 DistilQuinn,
Right.
that you can often match or even beat the standard thinking approach by basically short-circuiting that whole process. They call it not-thinking.
Short-circuiting it? How?
Well, we'll get into the specifics, but the headline is, especially when you're tight on compute budget, like limiting the number of tokens, Yuma not-thinking can pull ahead. They give this example, ACM23, with only 700 tokens. No thinking, hit over 51% accuracy, pass at 1, the standard thinking, just under 29%.
Wow. Okay. That's a pretty stark difference. So less thinking, fewer tokens, but better results in that case.
Exactly. It really challenges this assumption that more inference time, more tokens automatically means better reasoning.
All right. We definitely need to unpack this. This no thinking idea seems counterintuitive, maybe. How does it actually work? What's the prompt look like?
It's surprisingly simple, actually. They basically pre-fill the assistance part of the prompt. It looks like this. Beginning of thinking. Okay, I think I have finished thinking. End of thinking.
Wait, that's it. It just says it's finished thinking.
Pretty much. It simulates a thinking block, but it's super short and pre-written. Then the model just goes straight to the solution.
Okay, so it's like tricking the model into skipping the hard part.
Or maybe signaling that the hard part isn't always necessary in that explicit form. Compare that to the usual thinking method.
Right, where the model gets free reign between those beginning of thinking and end of thinking tags to generate pages of reasoning, reflections, corrections.
All that stuff, yeah. Figure 1 in the paper shows this contrast really clearly. One is just that tiny pre-filled block. The other can be this massive reasoning trace.
And the implication is huge, right? If this works, maybe we don't need to keep pushing for longer and longer inference times, more tokens, more latency.
That's the core idea. It suggests we might have more efficient ways to get good reasoning performance, especially if cost or speed is a factor.
Okay, so the method is simple. Let's talk about how they tested it. What was the setup? You mentioned the DeepSeek model.
Right. The main one was DeepSeek R1 Distill Q32B. It's distilled from the bigger DeepSeek R1 using the Kuhn architecture, but specifically trained on R1's outputs to be good at reasoning.
Okay, so it's already geared towards reasoning tasks.
Exactly. And they compared it against Qwen32B Instruct. Same architecture, but without that specialized reasoning training. A good baseline.
Makes sense. And the tests themselves. What kinds of problems did they throw at these models?
A real gauntlet, actually. For math, they had stuff like AM competition problems, AMC 2023, and even harder problems from Olympiad Bench.
Okay, challenging math. What else?
Coding, using Live Code Bench version 2. That's a pretty standard benchmark there. And also formal theorem proving.
Theorem proving, like mathematical proofs.
Yeah, using datasets like MiniF2F and ProofNet. These test really rigorous logical reasoning in formal systems, so a really diverse set of difficult tasks.
And how did they measure success? What was the metric?
Mostly pass at K, you probably know it, but just quickly. It's the probability that the model gets at least one correct answer if you let it generate K different responses.
Right, so K1 is just the first try. Higher K means you generate more samples and hope one is right.
Exactly. They use different values of K, sometimes up to 64 for smaller datasets, to see how performance scaled with more attempts.
Okay, setup clear. Let's get to the results. First, what happened without any strict token limits? Just letting the models run. Figure 4, I think.
Yeah, figure 4. So on the theorem proving tasks, Mini2F and ProofNet, the results were really interesting. Not thinking performed basically the same as thinking across all the K values.
The same, even without the reasoning steps.
Pretty much neck and neck. But here's the kicker. No thinking used way fewer tokens, like 3.3 to 3.7 times less on average.
Whoa. Okay, so for tasks where you can verify the answer easily, like with a theorem prover,
you might get the same accuracy much, much more cheaply just by using no thinking, fewer tokens, less compute.
that's already pretty significant. What about the other tasks, the math and coding stuff?
There, it was a bit more nuanced without budget limits. At K1, just the first attempt, thinking often had the edge.
Okay, so the first shot was better with the full reasoning.
Often, yeah. But as they increased K, sampling more answers, no thinking started catching up. And in some cases, it actually surpassed thinking at higher K values.
Really? Even beating the full reasoning approach?
Sometimes, yes, and crucially, it always did this using far fewer tokens, like 2 to 5 times less.
So maybe no thinking produces a more diverse set of answers, or just gets lucky more often when you sample more.
We'll touch on diversity later, but yeah, the key point here is the trade-off. Even without budget limits, no thinking is competitive or better when you sample, and way cheaper. Oh, and the baseline Quen Instruct. It generally lagged behind both methods, showing that reasoning training really helps.
Right, so that sets the stage. Now, what about when they did control the budget, this budget forcing thing?
Exactly. This makes the comparison really direct in terms of cost. They used a technique basically forcing the model to output a final answer once it hits a token limit.
So it might cut off the thinking process partway through.
Potentially, yeah. The details are in the appendix. They tweaked it a bit for each task, but it lets them compare performance at, say, 1,000 tokens for both methods.
And what does that show? Figure 5.
Figure 5 is where no thinking really shines, especially in low-budget situations. Under comparable token limits, say below roughly 3,000 tokens, no thinking generally beat thinking across all values of K.
Beat it consistently?
Pretty consistently, yeah. And the gap often got wider as K increased. So if you have a tight budget and you can afford to sample a few answers, thinking looks like a really strong contender.
That makes sense. If thinking gets cut off mid-thought, it might perform poorly, while no thinking is designed to be short anyway.
That could be part of it. And figure 6 really visualizes this well. It plots the Pareto frontier, basically. Accuracy, pass at K versus token cost.
And what's the story there?
No thinking consistently sits on a better frontier. For any given token budget, it generally gives you a higher pass at K score than thinking. Or, for a desired accuracy level, no thinking achieves it with fewer tokens. It's just more efficient.
Okay, the efficiency argument seems really strong. But why does it work so well? Did they look into the mechanisms? Any task differences?
They did. They noted some task-specific things, like on AMC 2023, all methods kind of hit a similar performance ceiling. And on the theorem-proving tasks, as we said, no thinking was great even at pass at 1 with fewer tokens.
So it's not universally better in all conditions, but often very competitive or superior, especially on a budget.
Right, and they acknowledge that the exact reasons why it varies need more research, it's complex.
Did they look into the diversity of answers generated by no thinking versus thinking? You mentioned that earlier.
They did, using entropy as a measure of diversity. Table 1 has the details. Interestingly, there wasn't a clear winner in terms of average diversity. Sometimes thinking was more diverse, sometimes no thinking.
Okay, so it's not simply that no thinking generates wilder guesses.
Not necessarily, or at least not consistently on average. But they did find something interesting about the variance of diversity. No thinking showed consistently lower variance.
Lower variance in diversity, meaning?
Meaning the level of diversity it produced was more consistent from one question to the next. It wasn't super diverse on some questions and very narrow on others. It was more uniform.
And how might that help?
The hypothesis is that this more predictable level of diversity might improve the chances of hitting a correct answer within K samples, even if the average diversity isn't higher. It makes the sampling process potentially more reliable. But they also say diversity alone doesn't explain everything.
Okay, that's an interesting angle. So this strong performance at higher K values naturally suggests using parallel processing, right? Generate lots of answers at once.
Exactly. If no thinking gets better with more samples, higher K, and each sample is cheap and fast to generate because it skips the long thinking,
then you could potentially generate, say, 64 samples in parallel, much faster and cheaper than generating one sample with full thinking.
Precisely. This leverages the pass at K strength while drastically cutting down latency. So they explored this parallel generation with no thinking, combined with different ways to pick the best answer out of the batch, what they call best of n aggregation.
Right, and how you pick the best depends on the task, doesn't it?
Totally. For theorem proving, you have a perfect verifier, the lean compiler in their case. So you just generate n proofs, check them all with a compiler, and take the first one that works. Easy.
Okay, simple enough when you have a checker. What about math or code, where verification is hard?
There, they used other methods. One was confidence-based selection, using the model's own self-certainty, basically, how much its internal probabilities align to pick the answer it seems most confident about. Another was majority voting, like board account. if multiple answers appear.
Okay, so they tried different selection strategies. What were the results when combining no thinking with parallel sampling, figure 7?
The results were pretty striking, with the perfect verifier on theorem-proving tasks. No thinking, plus parallel scaling matched or beat thinking on accuracy, but with a huge efficiency gain. Table 3 shows about a 7x reduction in latency and 4x fewer total tokens used.
7 times faster and 4 times cheaper. For similar accuracy, that's huge for deployment.
Absolutely huge. For applications needing fast, verifiable results, this looks incredibly promising.
And for the tasks without perfect verifiers, using confidence or voting.
Even there, using just simple confidence-based selection, no thinking, with parallel sampling consistently outperformed thinking under low token budgets on most of the math problems.
Better than standard thinking.
Often, yes. Especially on AMC 2023 and Olympiad Bench, no thinking actually achieved higher accuracy than the unconstrained thinking baseline, while being something like 9 times faster.
9 times faster and more accurate, wow.
Yeah, it suggests that generating multiple cheap no thinking samples and picking the most confident one can be more effective and way faster than generating one expensive thinking sample.
Were there any exceptions? Where did it not work as well?
5Code Bench, the coding task, was noted as an outlier. No thinking wasn't as effective there. They suspect that current confidence metrics might just not be very good at predicting code correctness. Coding is hard to judge without running it. Table 2 compares the different best of n methods, by the way.
Okay, so mostly positive, but maybe some task dependency, especially around verification or selection methods. Did they try this on smaller models too?
Briefly, yeah. They mentioned running tests on 7B and 14B parameter versions of the R1 models for the A tasks. Figures 8 and 9 show similar trends. No thinking still provides benefits, so it doesn't seem strictly limited to the biggest model in that family.
Got it. Okay, let's try to synthesize this. For our audience AI researchers, ML engineers, what's the main takeaway here?
I think the core message is really provocative, that explicit long chain of thought reasoning, while impressive, might not be the only way or always the best way to get high performance, especially if you care about efficiency, latency, or cost.
It forces us to reconsider what that thinking process is actually doing, or if we can achieve a similar outcome differently.
Exactly. Maybe the model learns an implicit reasoning process that doesn't need to be spelled out step by step in the output. Or maybe sampling multiple simpler paths is just more robust sometimes.
And what does this mean for people building or deploying these models? What are the practical implications?
Well, it suggests that maybe providers could offer modes that are much faster and cheaper. Instead of just one giant thinking output, maybe you get 10 no thinking outputs generated in parallel for the same cost or less, potentially with better overall results after selection.
It offers a different path to optimization, focusing on inference strategy alongside model architecture.
Definitely. And no thinking provides a really strong, cost-effective baseline. If you're working in a resource-constrained environment, this seems like something you'd absolutely want to try.
It really does feel like a solid baseline. So wrapping up this deep dive, it leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? If long chains of thought aren't always necessary, what are the real bottlenecks in complex reasoning for these models? Is it purely about scale? Or is it more about finding the right inference strategies, like parallel sampling or better selection methods? How do we best balance model size and inference techniques?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? This paper suggests the interplay is maybe more complex than just bigger model, longer thought, better answer. Lots to think about there.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for unpacking that paper with us today.
My pleasure. It was a fascinating one.
And thanks everyone for joining us on the deep dive. We'll catch you next time.